So again, we are continuing, and I want to show you the next part of test out. We've looked at how the simulator works, and now let's go to the next part. Let's go back to the screen here. Here we go. And we go to modules. There, now we're looking at the right screen. Okay. And there's a section, we finished up section 1.2, and now we're on to 1.3. So this will take a little while, a couple days. I'll go ahead and this part that says overview, somebody asked me about, it's just describing, what I'll do is this will just list what each module is about. So this is about hardware basics. And then about the due dates. What Friday refers to as the, not necessarily, it would, if, it would be at least a week or more than from today, whatever that is. It'll be next Friday, not today. And that's not a hard and fixed due date. I'm not going to make Canvas so it shuts it off, because test out doesn't shut it off. Test out doesn't have due dates like that. However, this is more of a recommended due date. In other words, there's a day, to keep pace, just not to fall behind. What we'd like to do in this course is complete about half of the course, and we found that in the past, let me go to the table of contents here. We find in the past that we're able to go through about half of this, which ends up being up through end of chapter 5. And then the next course will start in networking. These chapters aren't even linked. Some of them are short, some are really long. So it's kind of deceptive as far as how long the chapters are here. So as far as due dates, just kind of keep pace. I will put on our class website each week what we're going to do. Right? So we've got up there now, you're going to see 1.2, 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 so far. So 1.3 is called computing, it's hardware basics, and 1.3.1 is a video. Let's look at that. Now, as usual, that's going to pop up, the Canvas is going to pop up this test out box right here, and you want to click on that. That'll take you over to test out. Now we can play the video. You can also play it with a script that will print it out for you. I guess I can do that. But that makes the screen kind of small, so I'm not going to do that. These parts can be divided into two main categories, hardware and software. Hardware refers to the physical components that are installed inside of the computer system. By itself, hardware activities can be construction. Let me start that over again.
As a PC technician, it's very important that you understand the basic components that make up a computer. Computers are made up of constituent parts that work together to create a functional computer. These parts can be divided into two main categories: hardware and software. Hardware refers to the physical components that are installed inside or connected to the computer system. By itself, hardware can't do much. It needs instructions to tell it what to do. These instructions come from the software. Software refers to instructions or data that are stored electronically, either on a hard drive or on a special chip. Hardware without software is kind of like a car without a driver. A car has the potential to drive, but it needs a driver in order to see the potential. Without a driver, the car can't do anything. The same is true with hardware. Hardware has a lot of potential, but it needs software to instruct it to use that potential. The main thing to remember is that hardware is the potential. Software is the instructions. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the different types of hardware devices that compose a computer system. The first type of hardware device we'll look at is input devices. An input device is any piece of hardware that takes information from outside the computer and transfers it inside where the computer hardware can use it. The most common input device is a keyboard. A keyboard takes user inputs and sends them as electrical signals to the internal computer hardware where they are processed. When a key on a keyboard is pressed, an internal chip called a scanning chip identifies which key was pressed and then sends the appropriate code to the computer. The code could generate a letter in a Word document, a number in a spreadsheet, or a command for the computer. Another very common input device is a mouse. A mouse also uses inputs and sends them as electrical signals to the computer, but it does so a bit differently. A mouse tracks movements as XY coordinates. These coordinates are sent to the computer, which causes the mouse pointer to move in the same manner. The way a mouse tracks movement depends on the type of mouse being used. The most common type is an optical mouse. An optical mouse uses a light source and a sensor to track movement. A less common type is a mechanical mouse. A mechanical mouse uses a trackball, which rolls when the mouse is moved, along with sensors to identify which direction the ball rolls. Chances are you are very familiar with using these two input devices. Another input device we're probably familiar with is a touchscreen. If you've used a smartphone, tablet, or a computer kiosk, you've used a touchscreen. Instead of key presses or movement tracking, a touchscreen takes user input from screen taps. There are two main touchscreen technologies: resistive and capacitive. Resistive touchscreens use two flexible layers that are separated by a gap. Inside the gap is an electrical current. When the screen is tapped, the outer layer depresses and contacts the inner layer, creating an electrical signal that identifies XY coordinates. The coordinates are then sent to the computer. Capacitive touchscreens use a screen that is coated with a conductive material. An electrical current is then run through the material. When something conductive touches the screen, such as a finger, small sensors identify the touch and generate XY coordinates. Capacitive touchscreens are used on smartphones, tablets, and some laptops. But because they require a conductive touch, a non-conductive object, such as gloves or plastic, can't be used to tap the screen. Resistive touchscreens are typically used for airport or library kiosks. Because they require only pressure, any rigid object can be used to tap the screen. Now, signals generated by input devices need to be analyzed. This is done by using a processing device. A processing device is any hardware component that can analyze and interpret input information. The most common processing device is the Central Processing Unit, or CPU. The CPU is like the brains of the computer. It processes data according to a set of instructions or software. For example, when the A key on the keyboard is pressed, the keystroke information is sent to the CPU where it's processed based on the software that is currently running. If we were running word processing software, the letter A would appear at the cursor location in the open document. But if we were running a game, it might make the character move to the left. Another processing device is random access memory, or RAM. RAM is used to store processed information so it can be quickly accessed at a later time. For example, if a CPU were to process data from a spreadsheet software, but still needed to access that data at a later time, the data could be stored in RAM for quick access. RAM is also used to store running software. RAM can also be considered a hardware component called a storage device. A storage device is any hardware component that stores data, either temporarily or permanently. When data is stored temporarily, short-term storage such as RAM is used. It's important to know that RAM is considered volatile memory. It's not persistent. This means that when the power source is lost, for example, the computer is turned off, all the data that was stored in RAM is lost. It's gone forever. Now, you might be wondering why we would use a storage device that is erased every time it loses power. Well, the reason we use RAM is because it's extremely fast. Information can be accessed from RAM faster than any other type of storage hardware. But sometimes we need to store information permanently. This is done using long-term storage. Remember, short-term storage is lost every time the computer is shut down. Long-term storage, however, is considered non-volatile memory. It's persistent. This means that even when the computer is turned off, the data stored on the hardware will still be there when we turn the computer back on. There are a variety of long-term storage media. The most common one is a hard disk drive. Hard disk drives store information on rotating disks called platters. Another common medium is a solid-state drive, or SSD. SSDs use memory chips that are a lot like RAM. However, the information stored on these chips is persistent. Hard disk drives and SSDs can store a lot of data and access it relatively fast, but not nearly as fast as RAM. This is why we use both hard drives and RAM to store data. We also have optical storage media, such as CDs, DVDs, and Blu-ray discs, also called BDs or BRDs. Now, optical storage media can either be read-only or writable. If a disk is read-only, the information it contains is fixed and can't be modified or erased. It can only be viewed. An example of a read-only disk is a software CD-ROM or DVD-ROM. The ROM at the end actually stands for read-only memory. Writable disks, on the other hand, can be modified. Disks that are writable have an R or an RW at the end. For example, CDR, DVD-RW, BDR. The R stands for recordable. Unlike their ROM counterparts, these types of disks can have information saved to them. There are two more long-term storage devices we need to talk about. The first is a flash drive. Flash drives are small, portable devices that use memory chips to store information. These memory chips are very similar to RAM chips. However, the information is persistent. The second is a secure digital or SD card. You might be familiar with these. SD cards are used in smartphones, tablets, and digital cameras to store information. They use non-volatile memory. Now, all the information that is being input, processed, and stored on a computer is useless unless there is a way to access and view it. This is done by using an output device. An output device is any device that receives data from a computer and outputs it in a physical medium. The most common output device is a monitor. Monitors are used to visually depict the data that is processed by the CPU. Whether it's numbers being calculated in a spreadsheet or aliens running around a video game, a monitor displays a visual representation of the information being processed. Another very common output device is a printer. Printers take information that is processed by the CPU and print it on a piece of paper. Both monitors and printers output visual information, but there are more than just visual output devices. For example, another output device is a sound card. Sound cards take digital information and output it as audible signals. Almost all computers have some sort of audio output device. Now, all the devices we've talked about so far communicate information within a single computer. However, there are other hardware components that allow information to be communicated between multiple computers. These are known as networking devices. Networking devices are used to create networks. A network is a group of two or more computers that are connected together. To create a network, a special interface is installed in a computer. A connecting medium is then used to connect the computers together. This connecting medium can be a physical wire or even radio signals. With this connection established, these two computers can take information being processed by the CPU and send it to each other. This makes networking hardware both input and output devices. When one computer is outputting information, the other is inputting information, and vice versa. Now, there's one more aspect of computer hardware that we need to talk about called modular design. Modular design is a design approach that standardizes hardware interfaces in order to create modular hardware components. This means that a monitor that works on one computer can be connected to a different computer and still work. The monitor is modular. While this may seem commonplace today, it wasn't always the case. In the early days of computers, hardware components were actually proprietary. This meant that if a piece of hardware in your computer died, you couldn't just go to the store and buy a replacement. You actually had to ship the component, sometimes the entire computer, back to the manufacturer in order to get it fixed or replaced. Luckily, this isn't the case anymore. Because computer hardware is modular and standardized, you aren't limited to specific manufacturer or brands when buying or replacing hardware components. For example, if you want to install another hard disk drive in your computer, you don't have to buy it from the same company that built your computer. Any brand of hard disk drive will work. So, those are the basic hardware components of the computer system. Remember, there are two main computer component categories: hardware and software. Hardware is the potential, software is the instructions. In this lesson, we looked at the various hardware components that comprise a computer based on the 5 main functions they perform: input, processing, storage, output, and networking.
Great. Okay. So computers are modular. That's a great thing because that enables us to, here we go. It enables us to fix things easily. We don't have to, if you look at a typical motherboard, we've got all kinds of parts on there. But actually, for the most part, from a practical standpoint of servicing a computer that's malfunctioning, the entire motherboard is considered to be a module. When you buy a motherboard, it's all these components are mounted on there. But we can attach other components to it, right? We could attach, say, an expansion card, like in the simulation. Actually we did the same kind of card in the simulation. It was a FireWire. I happen to have one here. So we can add a new component to it. That's also considered a module then. And we can put that into one of the PCI or PCI Express slots there. So I've added another module to the computer.
Hey, I see you.
Yeah. And then if you consider the modules as a unit,
Your mic is off.
then that'll help, huh? Okay. If you consider that it's a unit, when you're servicing a computer, then if something malfunctions, let's say something goes wrong with the motherboard, usually you replace it. Or let's say my other module here that I put in, this expansion card, if it were to malfunction, then I would replace it. So that's the advantage of modularity, is it allows you to replace components easily and quickly. Now, let's say there's some component on here that malfunctions on the motherboard. Is it possible to replace some of those? It is possible. Sometimes people do repair individual components if they're able to locate them. Now, there are some components that mount, like, say, for example, she mentioned the CPU processor. That's a module as well. Right? I can take out the CPU here. I can open up the socket and remove the CPU. By the way, that's something you want to do. This is an old, motherboard that's not working, and I don't care about it. So, but if I were working with the CPU or an expansion card, something like that, I do want to be careful about static electricity. They're very sensitive to static electricity. If I happen to get charged up by walking across the floor, this room here has a floor that has paint on it, and it does make static electricity pretty easily when you walk across it. So you have to be really careful about not letting a spark go through something. But that's another module. That's another thing. Sometimes CPUs fail, and you can replace them. But there are a lot of components that are mounted on the board that aren't. You don't just pull them out or snap them in or out. They're soldered on. like these round cans here, these round cylinders are capacitors. They store charge. They're kind of like a battery. They store charge, but very temporarily. So those are not those are part of the entire module of the motherboard. It's possible you could be replaced if, say, a capacitor failed. Usually, what happens when a capacitor fails is it'll get a bulge on top of it, and the chemical will ooze out of them. But a lot of times, if something goes wrong on the motherboard, we would replace it. That's called a field replacement unit. So modularity is a nice thing because it allows us to repair things quickly. And like she said, they're interchangeable, right? I can if let's say this motherboard were to fail, I could get another motherboard. It doesn't have to be the same motherboard. I could get a newer, maybe a better motherboard, faster motherboard, one that has more capabilities, more capacity. Let's see, what else is on here? Oh, there's another thing. You can replace the battery right here. That would be like another module. Of course, I don't have to replace the motherboard. If the battery dies, I can just get a new battery, just like for your watch. You can put a new battery in your watch. Well, you can do that. The battery in the motherboard, its purpose is to keep track of the date and time, and because it's got a built-in clock. And if you didn't have the battery there, then when you turn off your computer, it would lose the time and date. So if that ever happens, if you notice your computer doesn't keep the time and date correctly, it's probably because the battery needs to be replaced. They last for 2 or 3 years. Then, just like your watch, they have to be replaced. So that's modularity. That's a great thing. That's a great feature of computers. It makes them, a lot of people think, well, computers are really complicated things, and they are. They have a lot of parts, but a lot of the parts are inside of other things. Like the CPU is a fantastically complicated device. It's got nowadays many hundreds of millions or even billions of transistors and other components inside of it. But we can't open that up and fix it if something fails inside. We just replace the entire CPU. Even the motherboard itself, without specialized equipment, it's very difficult to change some of the components. Let's say that, suppose this thing here is an integrated circuit. That's like the CPU. It's got a lot of components inside of it. If it were to fail because it's soldered onto the motherboard, it would be very difficult to replace that. It's possible you can do it with the right equipment. There are people that do that kind of work, but generally it's more cost effective to replace the motherboard, and in the process probably upgrade it to get a newer model or take to do that. So that's the nice thing about modularity. Okay. Now again, when you watch this, since you watched it with me, you still need to get the points for watching it. And the way you do that, let me show you a little trick here. Don't skip over the videos, but I just wanted to show you that, you launch it from Canvas so that you get the points, and then you're going to get there would be a button up here that would say Submit Score. But since you watched it already, if you don't want to watch it again, but you want to get the points, what you can do is, when you go to watch the video here, you start the video. Right, I'm going to just start it there for a second. And I have it turned off. So, the volume turned off. Since I want to, there's 2 things you can do. You can change the speed of it. And speed it way up. And then
Instructions tell what to do. These instructions come from software.
she talks
However,
fast.
construction data is very electronic. You got a hard drive or a session chip. Hardware has software. It's kind of like a car driver. A car has a petrol drive, but each driver has
Or
well, that's right.
you can go like this.
The same is true with hardware. Hardware has a lot of potential, but any software only. The information contains fixed and can be modified. Only you.
You can cheat, and it'll still show. It'll show the button and everything. But please don't do that if you haven't watched the video. Right? So do watch the video. It does record how much time you spend on it, especially for the online people. When we're together and we watched it. You know, go ahead and cheat. Get your points. But if you haven't watched it or you're on an online class, please don't just skip the videos, because it does record how much time you watch it, and it stores that in the records for the teacher, me, so I can see, hey, this guy spent 15 seconds watching the video. Obviously, he didn't watch the video. So do watch the video. If you, like I said, for the regular class where we watch it together, go ahead and skip. Go ahead and skip through the class. And then it'll have the button for you to put your points in there. All right, so that was computing basics, just a little overview of what the major parts of a computer, the major things that connect to the motherboard. She mentioned the memory, of course that goes in the memory slots here. And she said how the memory doesn't remember. Let me get my screen back here. I was forgetting to do that. Sorry. So she's talking about the memory modules here. That memory that is again another module. It's a thing that you can plug into there and take one of your memory modules, which have a bunch here we use. See, the memory modules, by the way, again, very static sensitive. So what you want to do is ground yourself. You want to touch something large that has preferably metal, but a desk or something to get that charge off of you before you start handling these. But this is another module, so that goes into the memory slots, and it can be replaced, or it can be upgraded. And she was saying how the memory doesn't remember if you turn the power off. But the reason we use it is because it's fast. And so when the computer is doing the computing, when it's working, when the CPU, the processor, this little guy here, this big guy, he's the brain of the computer, it's working with the memory. It's not processing the information off the hard drive directly. It's the information from the hard drive goes into the memory module, and the CPU works on the stuff that's in the memory module. The memory module stores the instructions that the CPU understands, and it has the information that those instructions are operating on. So the data and the program is both stored inside the RAM here. And then when the processing is completed, if we want to save it, then it goes to the hard drive. The programs are stored on the hard drive, but they have to be loaded into the memory before they're run. The programs, or sometimes people call them apps or applications, those come from your storage device. Your storage device here, this is a hard drive. This is where our software is stored that we install on our computer, but when it's running, it has to go into the memory module. And the memory module is where the program runs. And then, as it's being processed by the CPU, the instructions are in the program that the CPU follows. And we'll look at all of these different components in great detail in this class. This is just kind of an overview. We'll have there's a chapter or a section on we study the CPU, much more detail. There's another one on the memory and all these different expansion devices. There's Another section about hard drives and storage devices of different kinds. So all these different things we look at in much greater detail. Okay, now if we go back to modules, let's go ahead and put the screen share back here. Do that. There we go. Now, we have this section, so that was 1.3.1 computing basics. And then there's something that says computing facts. Now, what's that? Well, that's usually a something to read. That's what that would be. It's an overview of stuff. So it's got some of the same information that the video had in there, but it's saying, you know, like it's listing examples of hardware. What's the difference between hardware and software? Hardware is the electronic and mechanical parts of the computer, like the keyboard, mouse, monitor, connectors, cables, the motherboard, circuit boards of different kinds. Software, that's the programs and the data. That's stuff that it's information. Computers are information processing devices. And software just is. Computers can't work without, they have to have, accidentally turned it off. Computers have to have, there must be a dead battery. Computers have to have both, don't they? They can't operate, computers cannot operate without both hardware and software. If they lack one or the other, well, that's been this lasted a year.
How can I watch it online?
Oh, I'll put a link on our class website.
On Canvas?
Canvas, yeah. I didn't put one up yet because the one I made last time didn't work. This time I will. There was a okay. I'll put the old ones back in. Okay, thanks. He was asking how do you watch these videos that are going to be on our class website.
No. How do we watch you?
How do you watch me?
Yeah.
Well, only on the screen up here when I put myself up there. I mean, like this?
No, I mean like live broadcast.
Well,
We're at home.
oh, you would need to know the URL.
Yeah.
So I guess it's this one right here. But I would get to give you that link somehow.
Okay.
A bunch of stuff there, you'd have to type that in. He's asking how you can watch it live. Yeah, there will be a link on it. Be a link. Now, it won't be live, but you could have a link. Let's see. So I was going to say that the software, that's the program part. That's the data and information that tells the CPU what to do, instructions. And then they were differentiating between input and output devices. Input devices are things like keyboards, mice, things that send information to the motherboard. If you don't have input devices connected to your computer, you didn't have a mouse or keyboard, there'd be no way to communicate with it to make it, tell it what to do with it. So you got to have input devices of some kind. Even your cell phone, which is a computer, by the way, your smartphone has an input device. It's the screen. You touch it. So she was mentioning touch screens in there. That's a type of input device. And then, of course, a computer wouldn't be very useful if it didn't have some way to output things, and that would be the screen and maybe sound, things like that. Okay. So those are input and output. Input and output. And then we have the processing. We mentioned processing. That would be the CPU and the RAM work together. Random access memory. Didn't get you there. And long-term storage, things like hard drives, solid-state drives, optical drives, flash drives. Those things store information, and they don't forget when you turn the power off. Unlike the RAM, the random access memory, which does. And then networks. You have networks. Networks enable you to connect computers together to talk to each other. And we sort of take that for granted nowadays, but that wasn't long ago that computers didn't used to be networked very commonly. And then gradually, the first people started connecting them with wires. And these computers in the room here with us, well, they're connected with wires. I might just show you that for a moment here. We have these kind of cables going between the computers, and they have those connectors on the end. Oh, yeah. So we have these kind of cables going. That's one way to connect computers is a wire with wires. And then we have, of course, wireless things like oops, won't reach. You might have one of these at home, a router. That's a router, and it's also a wireless access point. Has antennas on it, so that you can communicate with it with radio signals, with 2.4 gigahertz radio signals. And that's a kind of network. And by the way, make everybody sick, huh? By the way, this is we use this in the class here. If you want to connect to the wireless, you can connect to our wireless with your laptop in this room for this little network here. The school's got a Wi-Fi as well, so either one will work for internet access. This one just happens to be really strong, and sometimes the school network in here isn't as strong for some reason. Well, I put the information on how to connect to the network if you want to do that. It's up on the wall up there. All right. Last thing. So again, you read through this, and there would be another. If there's a button to push, then you press that. Submit button. And now Now, what about the parts of a computer that are on the outside? I'm going to launch this from this out.
Computers use a variety of ports in order to connect external input and output devices. In this lesson, we're going to look at some of the more common ports.
Let's make her run at normal speed. All right.
Computers use a variety of ports in order to connect external input and output devices. In this lesson, we're going to look at some of the more common ports used by computers. Here's a diagram of the back of a desktop computer. Notice all the different ports down here. Let's take a look at each of these, starting on the left. These two ports here are called PS2 ports and are used to connect a keyboard and a mouse. PS2 ports are actually part of a family of connectors called mini-DIN connectors. Their technical name is actually a mini-DIN 6 port, but they're typically called PS2 ports. Notice how these ports are different colors. The majority of desktop computers use colors to denote the type of device that connects to the port. For example, the purple PS2 port means this is the keyboard port. The green means this is the mouse port. Occasionally, you might encounter a PS2 port that is half purple, half green. This means that the port can be used for either a keyboard or a mouse. Know that not all computers use color-coded ports. Sometimes ports will be black with small icons to identify the port. Sometimes the port won't have any identifier. To the right of the PS2 ports, we have a few ports we'll talk about as a group. These highlighted ports are all different types of video ports and are used to output display information. This is a VGA port. It sends an analog video signal to an external display. Next is a digital video interface, or DVI port. Unlike VGA ports, DVI ports are able to send a digital signal to an external display, resulting in a much higher quality image. These next two video ports also send a digital signal. The top port is an HDMI port. HDMI stands for High Definition Multimedia Interface. The one below it is a display port. The cool thing about these ports is that in addition to a digital video signal, they can also send a digital audio signal. This is great for connecting a computer to a TV. You can identify HDMI ports and display ports by their shape. HDMI ports are symmetrical. Both bottom corners are beveled. Display ports are asymmetrical. Only one corner is beveled. You are most likely familiar with these next ports. These 4 ports here are USB ports. USB stands for Universal Serial.
I just want to pause for a second and mention about why there's so many different ways to connect video to your computer. You have
Your audio's down again.
oh yes. Why are there so many different ways to connect video to your computer? Well, this type, this VGA, is the older style. It's still used a lot today. But you still use it, but it is an older technology. It's called an analog signal. It uses voltages to represent the video signal, to represent the scanning information that's, the picture on your screen is drawn from the upper left-hand corner across in lines very quickly from the top to the bottom. And this connector has the signals that tell it what colors to put up and what positions on the screen. And the other connectors that she was mentioning, the DVI, HDMI, and DisplayPort, are digital. And you might ask, well, why do they have all these different kinds of connectors? Well, a lot of motherboards don't have all these different kinds of connectors. It's just that this is a representation of a motherboard that does. Let's say you could have a motherboard that does have several different kind of connectors. And typically that is the case. Typically you'll find on a motherboard, you might find perhaps HDMI and VGA, or you might see VGA and DVI. Or you might see DisplayPort too. That's probably the more rare of the different types. So different companies have come up with these different ways of connecting monitors and displays to computers over the years, and they're all, they all are fairly popular, and so they never kind of went away. So you might find some motherboards that support some and not others. Fortunately, there's ways to adapt. If you have one, say your monitor doesn't have the right kind of connector, you can get an adapter, some kind of converter to convert. So you can convert from, for example, from DVI to VGA or VGA to DVI, or VGA to HDMI, that sort of thing. Like here, for example, I have a converter that converts, I'll show you that. See, here's a converter that converts, to remember to put myself on the big screen. Here is a converter that converts from VGA to HDMI. So that could, if you're, say your monitor is, well, I have a little computer I use in another class that there he is. We use a little computer called a Raspberry Pi. And the Raspberry Pi has, it has an HDMI on it. And then the monitors in here, well, they don't have HDMI, they have VGA and DVI. So we need to use a converter to connect it. So that's what I use it for. But that's very typical. You may have these different standards, so you need converters to be able to interchange between them to make them work. All right, let's finish up this video here.
Bus. USB ports are extremely versatile. They can be used to connect a mouse, keyboard, printer, digital camera, external hard drive, the list goes on and on. USB ports can be identified by the rectangular shape and the inside tab here. This tab prevents a USB plug from being inserted incorrectly. Notice this pair of USB ports is a different color. There are actually different versions of the USB standard. The blue identifies these ports as USB 3.0 ports, which are able to transfer information at a much faster rate than the black ones here. This port here is a FireWire port, also called an IEEE 1394 port. FireWire ports can connect much of the same devices that USB ports connect. However, USB ports are used much more often. FireWire ports can be identified by the rectangular shape that has one beveled side. These next ports we'll also talk about as a group. These highlighted ports are different types of audio ports. These two ports here are called SPDIF ports. SPDIF stands for Sony Philips Digital Interface Format. SPDIF ports transmit a high-quality digital audio signal. Notice the different connector types. This port here is a coaxial SPDIF port and uses a coaxial connector. This port over here is a fiber SPDIF port and uses a fiber optic connector. These ports here are also audio ports, but they transmit analog audio signals. The ports themselves are called audio jacks. Audio jacks are typically color-coded. The blue jack is the line-in port. The line-in port is used to transmit an audio signal into the computer, where it can be played by the computer speakers. For example, you could plug in a radio and play it through your computer. The green jack is the line-out port. This is used to connect speakers to the computer. The pink jack is the microphone port and is used to connect a microphone in order to record audio. Now, most of the time you'll only encounter these three audio jacks on the left here. However, higher-end motherboards will also have these two jacks, which are used with surround sound devices. The black jack is for connecting rear speakers, and the orange jack is for the subwoofer. The next connector we'll look at is the Ethernet port. Ethernet ports are used to connect a computer to a network. Ethernet ports use RJ45 connectors to connect to the network. Most new motherboards have one or more built-in Ethernet ports. The last port we'll talk about isn't used as much as it used to be. It's been replaced by most of the ports we've already talked about. It's the serial port, which is the port right here. The serial port, also called a DB9 connector, has 9 pins. The D in DB comes from the characteristic D shape of the port. Serial ports are used to connect serial devices, such as a barcode scanner. They look similar to VGA ports, but they have only 2 pin rows, not 3. So those are some of the most common ports used by computers. Remember, ports use either colors or icons to help you identify them, but this isn't always the case. Because of this, it's very important that you are able to identify the various ports used by computers by their look. By spending time memorizing these ports, you'll easily be able to identify a DVI port or line-out port at a quick glance, which is an invaluable skill.
So there's an overview of this on there. It's 1.3.4. Shows all the different ports, shows pictures of them, and describes them. And so there's an overview of the different connectors, summarizing what she's telling you there. Now, some of these connectors are considered obsolete. You know, there are connectors you will find on some computers and you won't find on others. I have here a motherboard, and it has this big purple one here. That's a parallel port. A lot of computers don't have parallel ports anymore. It's been replaced by USB. We have USB right over here. USB has taken the place of it. And then she mentioned the serial port. This computer also has a serial port on it, this motherboard. But again, a lot of computers don't have that particular connector. It's been replaced by USB. USB stands for Universal Serial Bus. And it takes the place of a lot of other connectors. So some of these connectors that we see here are obsolete, but you still need to know about them because you will find them a lot of places. One of the connectors that she mentioned is the PS2. What's that? PS2, that's an old connector you find on old motherboards. Even this motherboard, which is not particularly new, really, even this one doesn't have a PS2 on it, because PS2 has been replaced by the USB. And then the serial port, it's been replaced by USB. Now let's suppose you do need a serial port. What can you do? Well, you can get adapters again. There's adapters available for fairly low price, nothing costs that much. Parallel ports, if you need a parallel port, you can get an adapter for that. I probably wouldn't, find that to be very common, but you might. I know the serial ports, we have a class in here that needs and uses a little tiny computer that uses an adapter like that to talk to it. But and here's another example. Here's the port that's used for joysticks for games. Nowadays, if you get a computer, you won't find that port on your computer anymore because nowadays we use joysticks with USB, so we would use our USB. USB has replaced a lot of other types of connectors. Here's our USB type connectors. And you're quite familiar. USB, of course, comes in several different types. Well, we'll go through in greater detail on a lot of these different connections and these different ways of communicating in this class. So we're out of time now, and I'm going to stop the broadcast and say goodbye till next Tuesday.